Okay, so welcome back, everybody, to the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. And today we have Dr. Adam Hoffer from the Department of Economics, and the topic will be happiness, health, and the foundation of the modern economy. So thanks for joining us, Adam.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. So actually, I just look at the title, I feel like it's so interesting. So from your opinion, what do you mean by foundation of the modern economy? What do you think is the foundation?
So the field of economics was launched with a very simple question. It started with an observation that some countries in the world are wealthy while others seem to be poor. Why? And so in 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. It's the doctrine that we use to really, found the field of economics. And he studied everything from political systems to production processes to how things are exchanged around the world, right? And one of the fundamental conclusions that he came to is that, his answers were very simple, right? If we look across the world to see why, the Dutch were wealthier than the French, even though they had a much smaller country, fewer resources, it came down to actually keeping things rather simple from a control perspective of letting individuals make choices. And really, he dubbed these markets, right? We see markets that control prices and allow people to buy and sell things. And this is really what facilitates one country being wealthier than another, right? And so when we talk about foundations of the modern economy, it's rather simple. I think it's rather interesting. For much of the 20th century, we had this global debate about economic systems. Capitalism versus communism or socialism, or this top-down market organization versus really letting markets do their job, and what systems seem to work better, right? Which ones promote wealth, which ones increase happiness, which ones do all these good things that we want to see out of economic growth. And really in the 20th century, I think it's hands down easy to say that capitalism won that contest, right? But recently, especially in the United States, right, we've seen this idea that people argue capitalism isn't working or markets don't work. Why is that? And so when we talk about foundations of the modern economy, we really start with this idea of what is a market, how does it work, and why is it that we use those, right? Why did markets and capitalism work so well in the 20th century? And is this an economic system that we should be using moving forward?
That's beautiful put. So according to your description, the invisible hand, the free market, seems like economy focus more about wealth creation and richness, how to make people rich, how to make prosperity. So how are health and happiness tied to it? Because to my understanding, happiness is not a factor in the economic model yet.
So I will say that economics is working a lot more toward measuring happiness. It's not something that's easy to measure. And so it's one of the reasons we rely on production, output, prices, and just wealth as measures of well-being. We now have happiness indices, but the explosion in data available for not only the United States but global countries recently has allowed us to measure a variety of things that are not only happiness, for example, but things that are not wealth but tell a story of well-being. So life expectancy is a simple one. Infant mortality is another one, right? We can take all of these measures and say, well, even if we don't know exactly how happy people are telling us they are, we can presume that, relatively speaking, longer life expectancy is better than shorter, and less infant mortality is better than higher, right? So one of the things that we can do is we can look at happiness along those lines, but then when it comes to this course that I've created, what I not only want to do is focus on these macro level aggregates. This is what total wealth grew in the United States from 1990 to 2010. Right? I think that's interesting, but I want to take that and look at more of a personal level. I want to take this down to the individual level, because that's where I think that we can really get a resounding effect, and we can get our students and any of our audience interested in talking more about wealth and what happiness means to them. Right? Well, one of the things that we know in economics is that if we give 100 people $1,000, they might do 100 different things with that money, right? And what that tells us is that different things make different people happy, right? So when it comes to this this course that I'm developing, right, is intended for freshmen who have just arrived on campus. Right? Actually, I want to start with an even more fundamental question to them. Why are they here? Right?
In college?
Why are they on a college campus? Right? Why do people go to college? Well, people usually go to college to get a degree. Right? And then why do you want a degree? Well, a degree does two really important things for you. Right? Our economic data tell us that if you have a degree, you're expected to make a lot more money over your lifetime if you don't. Right? So there's a wealth factor there, and there's money, right? It gives you a lot more choices. But then also, you can get a degree that allows you to work in a job that you like, right? Which may be even more important to overall happiness than the difference in wealth that the degree creates, right? Like, I love getting up and coming to work, right? That makes me happy. I think that is more important to my happiness than if I were to take a slight raise and go work somewhere that I didn't like, right? So when it comes to foundations of the modern economy, wealth, happiness, and health, these are all related. And really what I want to do in this class is have an open discussion, and we can talk about the amazing research and volumes of research that we have that has explored this topic already, in order for the students to create their own path, right? Come up with their own journey for what it is that's going to make them, ultimately, we're pursuing happiness. Right? How do you get happier? Well, we have a couple answers, and we know things that make people happy. It tends to be wealth is in there. Right? I think for most people, having more money is preferred to less. But then also, the freedom to get up and do what you like every day. And then obviously health is an extremely important factor, obviously connected with all of the other factors that we've talked about. All right. So these are all intertwined. And I think what we want to do is to, we want to allow people to think, what is going to make me happy? And then let's give them the tools to pursue that journey.
That's interesting. But as far as I understand, economics is the study of always at the macro level with a lot of people, a big group of people. Does it work at the individual level?
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm a microeconomist. I deal far more with the behaviors of individual people, of individual companies, of really, individuals making their own choices. Now, usually when we do this, I mean, the scientific approach, we need to study what many individuals do in order to find a pattern, to find an analysis, right? If we're going to look at, health responses to to filing for unemployment, right? We have to have a large number of people to look at to make any sort of conclusions. But really, the field of economics is split between your macro folks, those that look at country level aggregates. They deal with these national measures of inflation and unemployment and GDP growth. And then the micro world that I live in, and we look at individual behaviors. I'm a behavioral economist by my research background, right? So I think the book Nudge really gave opened this world of behavioral economics to the general populace, right? And so we look at these individual behaviors and try to figure out what people do and how they try to pursue their own level of increasing their happiness.
That's interesting, yeah, because I was thinking about everything you mentioned just now is clearly a study from philosophy, right? How do you find yourself? How do you define life goal and everything? So I was wondering, like, how are you going to approach it using economic terms and everything? But yeah, what you said totally makes sense. Seeing what a group of people are doing, everybody are doing, supported by research, can somehow give me a lot of options to explore, right?
Yeah, so I tell my students, I also teach principles of microeconomics on day one, that the field of economics is fairly young, right, compared to the fields of philosophy or psychology, right? And so what is economics? Economics is you take all of those and you mix them together in a pot, right? The behavioral economics comes directly from the field of behavioral psychology, and the field of behavioral psychology is much older than the field of behavioral economics, but we apply those. The concepts within economics we apply much more heavily to like financial decisions, wealth choices, pricing decisions. Those have far more emphasis in behavioral economics than a broader field of psychology or even philosophy. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, basically, like philosophy and psychology are everywhere as long as you involve human, right? But it's more about like, which perspective you focus more on. Can you give us some examples on behavioral economics? What is it, and what are some fun case studies there?
I can sit here all day and talk about behavioral economics with you. I'll borrow a lot of my examples from some of the most popular books on the topic, Nudge, and then Freakonomics does a lot of work in this area too. And so a couple of sort of the more famous behavioral studies that I think are applicable and interesting. So if we look at, there's the standard parable of let's start by setting the scene with a cafeteria at lunchtime. Right, you pick up your tray at the start of the line, and then you put the food on your tray. When you get to the end of the line, you pay, and then you sit down and eat. So we can study what ends up on someone's tray. And it's fascinating that if you take a look at sort of the buffet of options available to you, the things at the start of the line are much more likely to end up on your plate than the things at the end of the line. Now, if we put this into a behavioral economics context, if we're studying, the idea of healthier choices, right, and trying to promote, weight loss or just general healthy choices, right, then you can, if you put salad at the front of the line and cookies at the end of the line, you're going to see people take more salad, right? Now from a behavioral economics concept, right, all the same choices are there. You could just put nothing on your plate till the end of the line and load it up with cookies if you want it, right? But the behavioral approach can say that, well, if we just put salad first, then people will eat more salad and fewer cookies. And actually, moving on to a different example here, one of the things that some of my colleagues have been working on, and I think it's fascinating to look at the benefits for UWL employees and UW system employees. It's fascinating to study the choices that we make, right? And so very recently, we had an opportunity to look at some health plan changes within UWL and UW system. Some employers changed, one went away, they rebranded themselves as Quartz, right? And so anybody who had the previous system had to make a new choice, and you had to pick a new healthcare plan. Well, our health economist, who sits one office over from me, she took all of the data on healthcare premiums, how much you would spend out of pockets on all these different sorts of cases, right? At any dollar amount of health expenditure. And she mapped them out, and she said, what's fascinating here is that one plan is clearly better than the other plan. You will spend less money if you pick the high deductible plan at any level of healthcare expenditure. And then she went on to the UWL benefits website, and there's a giant big arrow that says most employees pick this plan, and it was not the high deductible plan. Right? And so you see these sort of, in economics, we call these nudges, right? You don't affect the choices that are available, but you can signal people what other people are doing, and that helps some people make choices, right? So if you see this big arrow that says most people pick this plan, maybe you're not going to sit down and read the pages and pages and pages and pages of healthcare information to make your choice, right? And she said this is fascinating because this is an example of a nudge in the wrong direction. we'll call it that way.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then there are just so many more examples of you could change the default on things. The default is that you contribute to your retirement plan, right? You can fill out the paperwork that says I want to opt out, but the default is that you opt in, and most people aren't going to go fill out the paperwork to opt out, right? So by doing nothing, by just changing the default, you encourage more people to save for retirement. Same thing for organ donation. If it's at the DMV, if there's a box, if the default is that you are an organ donor and the box on the form says I want to opt out, fewer people will opt out than if the opposite were true. If the default was you're not an organ donor and you have to check a box that says opt in, right? So simply by changing the default options, you can see a really marked difference in the eventual outcome, the choices that people make.
That's interesting. So basically, when I read about the classical economics ideas, you assume every individual is a rational human being and they make rational choices. If plan A is better than plan B, everybody's going to pick plan A. If there's an incentive, everybody's going to respond it rationally. But now if you factor in psychology, you figure out actually so many times we just make decisions out of no reason. We just do it unconsciously.
Well, I mean, I'd say one of the most important discoveries of recent years is that decisions are hard, right? Decisions are costly, right? If only on mental energy, right? And we can see this in in every day of your life, right? Like if I have to sit down and make a decision after decision after decision, I parent 2 children before I get up and come to work. And if I have 15 parenting decisions to make before I get in my car and come to work, by the time I sit down at my desk, I'm exhausted already, right? And that makes other decisions later on in the day more difficult to make, right? And so we see that when people get worn down mentally, it's no different than getting worn down physically, although it's harder to see and sometimes more difficult to identify. But when you get worn down mentally, it's very similar to getting worn down physically, right? If I'm worn down mentally, I don't want to put a lot of mental effort into choosing what I'm going to have for lunch, so I'll just order delivery, right? I don't want to go home. I don't want to make it. I don't want to cook, right? I'm mentally tired, so I'll call Jimmy John's, right? It's the easier mental thing to make. Even if I made a plan a week ago that says I'm not ordering out, then it doesn't matter if I'm tired in the moment, right? So I think one of the more interesting discoveries recently is that decisions can be hard and they can add up over the course of the day. And when people are mentally fatigued, they make different decisions, generally leaning towards what's easier.
Interesting. So we have limited attentions basically per day.
Yes.
And then when we're wearing off, basically we start to make decisions out of no resource, and that's when we start to randomly pick stuff, or maybe just pick the easiest one, right? Yeah, I totally get you, because I'm those kind of guy. If you give me a default option, I won't even look at the second option. I won't even read it. I don't, unless somebody just come here and tell me like you just said, the second one is better. Then I say, okay, second one. But I don't want to bother reading it or doing anything. So if the university actually give me a certain kind of, don't read all these, just tell you the second one is better, I would definitely go there and just pick the right one. But I just don't want to, spend my time and energy to do that.
Right. I do the same thing, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, we're all human. I didn't realize that I opted into the slower growth retirement account for the UWL retirement system until about a year ago. And I'm like, how did I make this mistake? Right? I'm the one who took the screenshot of the, by default, by default as UWL employees, we are defaulted into the slower growth retirement plan. It's 50% bonds, or I think it's something like 80% bonds, 20% stocks.
Yep.
There's a higher growth plan, but you have to fill out the form to opt into it. And I just never filled out the form. And so again, I just stuck with the default, and I haven't wanted to crunch the numbers, but the difference in returns over 10 years is large, right? And we all do this. And so I think that's one of the things I want to convey to students is if you can recognize this, then you can plan for it, right? I mean, from everything to, consumption choices in the dining hall to sexual health choices, right? Like, you can plan for scenarios that you might be fatigued at the end of the day, or you might be placing yourself into a situation that, again, if you're fatigued, you might make a decision that you don't want to make. Right? So if you plan for that, then you can be better prepared and help yourself make better choices when the time comes.
That's interesting, because if you just think about how we pick our retirement plan, the money difference there is way bigger than am I going to buy a $5 burger or $6 burger? But sadly, most of my energy was spent on the $5 and $6 burger, the difference compared to, those kind of big gaps in my investment plan. That is really interesting. But then another thing came to my mind is, during the old days, when you want to subscribe to a certain kind of service, you actually need to fill out and renew every month. Now they just flip the switch and say, hey, now we automatically renew you, and you need to actually just fill out something, which is basically just click, or maybe just fill in some information to cancel. And suddenly we just got hooked to the plan for so much longer, simply because we just forget to cancel it, or just we think, how hard can it be? But it's another $20, $30 a month, right? You just click, spend you like 2 seconds, you're out. But since the people doing business are taking advantage of that, I would say, in terms of design and everything, how do we differentiate between, the behavioral economics done right and manipulating people, or manipulating a crowd, not just a single people? There's a lot of people there. You're talking about national, statewide.
Yeah, I that is the question of the day in terms of the interaction of business with behavioral economics, right? Scientists will argue, and rightfully so, that companies will study their products and they will do whatever is in their incentive to retain customers and to make more money, right? That subscription example you gave is the perfect illustration of that case, right? And it's been going on for decades because, right, for example, gym memberships, they realize that if they get me to sign up on a recurring payment, then I'm far less likely to go cancel it than I would be to just keep paying it, because, well, maybe I'll go next month, or, so on and so forth. Right. And so the real question is, what is best for people? Right. Now, what I think is fascinating is that, so we're kind of going down the rabbit hole here, but now companies have created algorithms to figure out if you're subscribing to things, and they will tell you about that. And so I think of Mint.com, for example. They will review every dollar that is spent out of your bank account or on a credit card, right? And they'll go through and say, hey, it turns out you have 2 gym memberships. You're like, oh no, whoops, right? It's like, do you want to cancel one of them? Actually, yes, I would. And so we're innovating new ways to help people make better decisions to overcome these behavioral biases. And so I think this is fascinating to follow and to see really what's going on. But you're right, this ebbs not only into business, but I think the things that have made headlines most recently are in the political world, right?
Exactly.
With the you see campaigns hiring behavioralists to create Facebook ads that are, I mean, and what we've seen happen because of these behavioral studies is that things have become far more polarizing, right? That you're not winning a vote, you're not winning a voter by settling into the middle ground, right? Like they found that if you want to win a voter, you have to paint the opponent as sort of a complete villain, right?
Basically, go to the extreme, go to the very far side.
And I mean, there have been real consequences of this, right? And I think this is where we are. Like this is where this is where I hope the students that we bring in 2020 can contribute to this discussion by the time they graduate, all right, or by the time they get jobs. They can be a positive force for really, and again, this comes back to what economics is designed to study, for making people better, right? Making as many people as better off by as much as possible.
Does those kind of mindset conflict with freedom of choice?
I mean, I would say that there is some conflict there. The general idea of behavioral economics as a whole, and even nudge theory, is that you want to leave choices intact, right? But nobody's saying that choice isn't influenceable, right? And so this idea of having the freedom to make a choice, people can choose, but people can also be influenced too, right?
Yeah.
And so really, I think, I mean, and this is going bigger picture here, but I think this is perhaps why, us at a university, this is why we're more important than ever in terms of stimulating ideas, having discussions. And I mean, I want to teach my students how to think critically, right? It's a really hard thing to pin down and to identify, right? But we need more critical thinkers, right? And if you're a critical thinker, then I would hope that you would be able to hear multiple perspectives, multiple arguments, and make an informed and rational decision. And so I think the idea of promoting critical thinking is as important now as it's ever been.
Interesting, yeah. Because I was thinking about, I follow a lot in terms of algorithms and design of big data approach. And clearly, before in behavioral economics or in behavioral science in general, people conduct lab studies. But now with the capacity of A/B tests and big data, people basically can say, hey, we can actually do social experiment with, 2 million or 200,000 people at the same time. Through social media or online platforms and things like that. So the prediction are pretty damn accurate. So that's when I started to feel like, okay, with algorithms, companies can achieve a lot. So you think as a customer, I think I'm making the decision, but am I really making the decision? And how far the company can go in terms of like manipulating people to do the stuff they want people to do. So I always have this conflict feeling, because before I think, well, this is evil, right? You're trying to convince people using whatever method which will work, and it's going to be effective to make them do the stuff you want. But then the second thought is, isn't that all marketing is about, to make you buy stuff you don't actually need? So the only difference is just like tech companies are doing it more successfully. And suddenly that feels scary. But before, we're doing the same thing because we're so bad at doing that thing, so we still feel okay.
Well, sure. So I'm an economist, so I don't mind bashing marketing a little. But so that is the role of marketing, is to convince people to buy things. Now, if you can take a nefarious view, right, and say that marketing is educational, right, and that's what all marketing is. right? Now, what I think is fascinating is what you said, sort of the big tech, the integration across platforms of our data.
Yeah.
You know, but sometimes I think it's wonderful. You know, I happen to Google directions from La Crosse to another city, driving directions. Right? And the next time I opened my Facebook app, there was an ad from Amazon about a children's tray that they could play with while driving, right? And on one hand, I was astonished, like I can't believe sort of the sequence of events that just happened. And on the other hand, I thought that would make my life better.
True. Yeah.
I will gladly pay the $9.99 to Amazon for this to arrive in 2 days on my doorstep because it makes my life better. Right now, this is so. I think we can take a step back and say, well, where does this cross the line between good and bad, or approach evil? So what are the objectives of the advertising? If it's getting you to buy something, I think that it's going to be hard to argue that that's evil in any way. Now, in part because you don't ever have to buy it, right? I do see potential long-run consequences of constantly being bombarded with things that you should buy, to having that being detrimental to your long-run well-being.
I actually have another thing to ask here, but
sure.
Sometimes you kind of feel like you don't want to buy something, but they just keep pushing you the advertisement, and some people just feel like I cannot control myself.
Sure,
right? You can see those kind of things when purchasing. People keep sending you ads, okay, this is toxic, I need to get away from this. But you can see a large population of the people just couldn't control themselves when got hooked up with things like that. Same thing works with Instagram. The same thing with like, I should stop spying on other people on Facebook, or I should stop posting my photos. But as time goes by, I kind of feel like because the thing was designed so well in terms of behavior, it actually hook people up and make them addicted.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of their strategy. Is these companies, I mean, Facebook in particular, they want you to be on Facebook as much as possible, right? Like that's how the company makes their money, right? By you being on their platform, right? And so these things are designed to be addictive, right? And so that's how games are designed these days. I mean, if you want to talk about things that are potentially dangerous to well-being, look at the variety of forms of video games, whether it's on your cell phone or on a computer, right? These games are designed to get you there and keep you hooked.
It's toxic, like especially for kids, right? If you give them something like you just spend $5 every hour or something like that, they don't realize how much money they have spent on that game already. Sure. And it's difficult for them to put it down.
Well, it's not only the monetary factor. I mean, the monetary factor is big, but if you spend if you're spending 12 hours a day in front of a computer screen, you're missing all of the other normal developmental opportunities that we would expect, right? Socializing with friends, playing outside, all of these things that's built into creating somebody that can make informed choices and participate in an educated society later on in life, right? And so these are dangerous, right? So I think that the challenge moving forward is, how do we combat that, right? And I think that so some may argue that these platforms themselves are trying to create ways, and it's not untrue. Facebook has implemented some features that say, there are no more news stories since the last time you opened the app. So you're just scrolling through the same thing, and that tells you that you are spending maybe too much time on there. I think of the fact that my iPhone now gives me summaries of how much screen time I am on it. It gives me a weekly summary every week of how much I spent time on there of every day of the week. Right? And so that information, that feedback coming back, I think is helpful. And then for almost every problem that you've described, there is a company out there who is providing something to help you combat that if you recognize it as a problem. Right? And
Interesting.
that's a big if, but I think that companies are coming up with these ways to help you solve these problems. It's interesting. We were talking about screen time. I downloaded an app just 2 weeks ago that it will change the color of my computer screen as it gets later and later into the evening, because I'll be sitting there at 9:45 at 10 o'clock at night, writing emails, doing things, and my computer screen will be getting less and less attractive to my eyes. And I get little reminders in the upper right-hand corner that say, you're waking up in 8 hours. You're waking up in 7.5 hours. And at one point I'm like, okay, I got to close this and I have to get to bed.
That's interesting. Even your computer get tired.
Right. I mean,
Right?
my computer starts yelling at me to get off of it and go to bed.
Beautiful. Yeah. That was just the thing. Just keeps bothering me. Is just where the line is and how much of us can actually really be aware and control ourselves. Seems like the class you're teaching is actually teaching students how to at least be aware of some of them and give them some possible solutions to combat this.
Well, sure. I think that's where we are, right? Let's start with step one and figure out where we are and where we want to go. I think I can't think of much of a better way to start a college career. Right? Where am I and where do I want to go? Right? And then let's figure out how I can make my life better and go on this journey of life that will make me as happy as possible.
That's interesting. Do you see any ideas from behavioral economics can be borrowed by UWL to actually, change the behavior or enhance the behavior, or, to the freshman students?
Oh, the freshman students. I thought of this question at length in terms of how we can improve things for us, especially as employees.
For the cafeteria, especially for the cafeterias, right? We can ask the freshmen to eat more salad. That's clearly already an idea we can apply.
So, I have some broad ideas, but I haven't studied this extensively. But I will say that there are other, centers on campus that are taking this approach, right? The UWL Health Center will go find students where they are and hand out free condoms, right? It's trying to reduce those barriers to making those kinds of decisions in order to, right, be prepared if you find yourself in a situation that you wish you had one, right? And study after study has shown that some of these decisions are really hard to make. If the decision is to do something the way that I have planned for my life, or in this exact moment, right, make a different choice, right? And so you can plan to be in a better spot. I do think that, in general, we're trying to offer healthier foods. I won't say that this is a choice by people trying to, act on the students' behalf and take away cookies or anything, but the fact that students might want to eat healthy leads to some of our providers of food trying to offer healthier options, right? And so there are different groups trying to help students make better decisions in a variety of different ways. And I think that some of them are working, right? And again, there are just so many different aspects on a college campus, from mental health to literally meeting with your advisor to figure out registration for classes and check in. We can talk about the early alert system. I think is a big one being pushed campus wide, right? To contact students within the first couple of weeks of a semester to see how they're doing, right?
It's really interesting. You would assume everybody knows how they're doing, but just sending that one single alert will make a difference.
Sure, and it's not only the fact that right, as professors we're outnumbered hundreds to one, right? Number of students we teach to us, right? And while we would love to take have an interest in the day-to-day activity of all of our students and how they're doing, it's simply not feasible for most of us, right? But then we can build in additional systems on campus, right? If we have one system where I send an alert to all of my students that I think are challenging or I haven't seen in classes, and all of a sudden all of that data, here we go again, right? All of that data gets pulled at a central office, and somebody can say, wow, this one student has concerns from 3 different faculty members. Maybe somebody from student life can directly contact that student and see how they're doing, right? And so these are sort of these integrative ways, again, of using this data to try to help our students along, because I think that's one of the areas that we've seen colleges and universities change remarkably over the past 40 years, right? College used to be a professor in a room with a chalkboard, right? And they gave an exam and you passed or you didn't pass, right? And colleges and universities have moved to this, really this life center, right, of well-being, not only educationally, but mentally and physically, sort of this holistic picture of how can we help those that have paid to come here, right?
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, we have 10 minutes left since you need to go. I want to cut into the important question mentioned in your title. So your personal definition, what is happiness? What is well-being?
I don't know if I have a great teed up definition of what is happiness. I mean, not without cheating and saying.
You were saying like you're going to help students to find that, right? Have you found yours yet?
So I think that I can find the things that make me happy. I'll put it that way. I can find the things that make me happy, and I think if we look at empirical studies of happiness, it's really important to identify the things that make me not happy as well, right? So, for example, I strongly dislike spending time in cars or traffic and waiting in line, right? So I live half a mile from the university and I can walk to work if I feel like it, because, just again, studies of happiness show that if you take away a negative to your happiness, you're going to feel a lot happier than if you, say, add in a positive, right? Like, I like cookies, but if we weigh the two, sitting in traffic and eating a cookie, I'm going to be losing my mind being unhappy. Right? So I think part of this is figuring out what it is that makes you happy, right? And these change all the time. 5 years ago, I wasn't a parent. 5 years ago, I absolutely loved spending hours and hours and hours reading research articles, creating new research, right? And fast forward 5 years, I still enjoy that, but I spent yesterday flying a kite with my son in a park, and that made me remarkably happier than sitting by myself reading the latest journal article that was out, right? And so these things certainly evolve over time, but I do think it's really important as a first step to figure out what are the things that make you happy, and what are the things that don't make you happy. And then we can grow from there, because I think this feeds into a lot of what we've been talking about. I think, for example, watching Netflix, right? Watching a Netflix show might make me happy, but watching show after show after show after show after show, I get less and less happiness from each additional episode. But Netflix is designed with the automatic play of the next episode to keep me there, right? But I've learned part of this from just studying myself, that after one episode, I don't want to sit on my couch anymore. I want to get up and move around, so I can turn it off. My children still struggle with this. They would sit and watch shows for as long as I let them. But if we come into a college class, right, I think that's something we can sit down and think about. What is it? And that's going to be one of their homework assignments, right? Like, I want you to sit down, look at your life for the past week, the month, the year, and figure out, like, just put down on a piece of paper or type onto a computer, right? What are the things that make you happy, right? And how does that change as you consume more or less of them, right? And then you can do the same thing with the things that make you unhappy, right? And that alone, I hope, will help students make better choices.
That's beautiful put. Actually, yeah, this clarifies my first question is how is this different from philosophy? Because philosophy, we think about what is happiness. You start to think about the ultimate questions. You start to actually say meaningful relationships, meaningful work, and everything is so fuzzy in the air, which is a good mind exercise. But it seems like your approach is very concrete. You're trying to quantify things. You're trying to say, hey, there are 5 things I don't like, and each one, hopefully I can give it a number, like a +5 and -5 and +3. And by the way, negative utility has a bigger impact on than the positive utilities. Like the thing you hate, even though they're weighted like -3, is actually bigger than +3. You sum them together, it's not 0. And also, yeah, you're trying to quantify things, and that's really interesting approach I'm seeing here. I never thought about economics that can be used in this way on an individual.
Just give me chills a little bit. Yeah. You explained it so well that I just had this vision of all of my students being able to come back and tell that to me after we have class, because that sums it up, I think, perfectly, right? That is what we want to do. I would love, and I think most economists would love, to be able to say, like, this gives me 7 units of happiness, and this gives me 1 unit of dishappiness. Right now, assigning specific numbers to those, I think, is perhaps an exercise we're doing, but we're not going to take away too much value from it. But that is the way we want to think about it, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like same thing with like, for example, you mentioned Netflix. You talk about marginal happiness you get from Netflix, right? Those kind of economic concepts can actually really work on the individual. And also, if you think about like opportunity cost, yeah, you can sit here to get some fun by watching the next Netflix, but also meanwhile, you're missing the opportunity to play outside, which will give you another, kind of fun. So that's really interesting mindset about economics you can put on an individual's life. So even just learning some economics, it won't make you an economist later, or maybe you're not going to do any job in economics later. But those kind of mindset are really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so this is somewhere, and I mean, this is the reason I wanted to make the course, because when you get into what we think of as a traditional economics course, we do spend far more time on that, should you produce an 8th unit that costs $7 and is going to sell for $12? Because those are the kinds of decisions that we would expect our students to make acting in firms, right? If they go into work in a bank or at an insurance company or whatever, that's the kind of economics training that the employers would expect our students to have. So I was I'm really excited to teach this course, because we get to take a step back from that and say, let's start with you, right? Like, let's start with what makes you happy. And then what I think is fascinating is that if we can figure out what some of those things are, the next step is, can we make a plan to help you do those things, right? I think, most of us like to say that we want to work out. So now we can borrow, if it is important to you, and maybe it's not, but if it is, now we can start borrowing things from the behavioral psychology literature to say, all right, what kind of commitment devices work and which ones don't? Right? And we can try to plan those activities around this idea of, right, maximizing happiness.
That's so beautiful. Yeah. Once you put everything into a theory, it's so clear. Like everything's like way more clear once you have the theory behind it. Yeah. And when you look into the life, you can see a lot of designs which you didn't notice before. Like how does people design FitFlex, Fitbit, or like why do they?
My Apple Watch, right? Like this thing. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that this changed my life in terms of it tells me if I've been sitting in a chair for an hour straight, right? It just says time to move, right? And I can ignore it if we're in the middle of a conversation that's going to go 2 hours, or if you're in a job interview, right? You can ignore that. But if I'm sitting here writing or doing grading, right? And it says you've been sitting here for an hour, right? And there's all this volume of research behind that says sitting for long periods of time is really unhealthy, right? They say sitting is the new smoking, right? Then the simple nudge on my watch will tell me to get up and walk to the water fountain, right? Or just go do something, right? And so it also, it will tell me how much I've moved throughout a day. Sometimes I do laugh at it because at 10 o'clock at night, it'll say just a 23-minute brisk jog. You can close all of your activity rings for the day. Some days it doesn't happen. But I do think it's these kinds of innovations that can hopefully nudge us to be happier, healthier, and wealthier.
It's really interesting for me to see later if you teach this class, like you ask students to actually collect data on their own variables, define a variable for yourself, and collect them and make predictions. That would be really fun to see.
I really want to try that. It helps that the course already has an embedded journaling assignment in it. The students are supposed to journal every Friday, and there's a set of preloaded topics on it that are based on sort of the general university level things that we're trying to get students to do. Again, there are these broader missions on, we have It Makes Sense. It's a financial literacy center. So there's a journaling assignment already built in to tackle some basic financial questions, like how much money do you spend in a month?
Isn't that beautiful?
Right. And so I'm eager to map on top of that and to see where this goes.
Interesting. Yeah. Basically, you just offer a student a whole new way, started a whole new way to to evaluate their life. And then hopefully through evaluation, you can start to see where this is going and also decide, is this really the direction you want to go? If not,
exactly.
Change something, right? So
right.
that's pretty cool.
Exactly. I'm super excited. And then, I think what we can offer is because, there are other ways to do what we just talked about, these sort of self-evaluations of goals. But then what the university setting has the ability to offer is, how can we fuel those, right? Like, yeah. How can we give you the tools you need to then go on that journey that will make you happy? And then what is the real research behind what we're going to try to do, right? It's not Googling something and reading internet forum debates about which way is better. The example I like to give here, my wife and I recently had, I guess a little over a year ago, we had our second child, and an economist went through it and wrote a book called Crib Sheets, and it is she's like, I'm an economist. I want to know all of the research behind breastfeeding. So I went and read it all. And then I put the summary into this book, right? And those are the kind of things you can do at a university setting, right? You can go to the library and read every research article that's been written on a topic that you're passionate about, right? And those are the things that, like, again, so this is further down the line. I doubt that they'll be doing it by the end of my course, but I hope that these are the things that they are going to be doing in 2 or 3 years.
Beautiful. That's great. Yeah, I really would like to see students reading things that are not just required by a class, but reading something really related to themselves, and they pick the readings, right? So that's beautiful. Well, we hit the time mark pretty quickly.
Yeah, but I tell you what, this was a blast. I appreciate you having me on. This was great.
It has been fun, but I just want to close with my takeaway from today. So self-retrospection is something I try to teach all my students to do. But now I just realized I always taught them to do it qualitatively until I figure out you do have a quantitative way to do that. which is way easier and way more solid. So if anybody wants to try anything like that, just, I mean, just take this class and have some fun with it. Well, thanks for joining us today, Adam.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.